Hello, I'm CM Angus. The readings I'm going to do today are the prologue and one of the later chapters from Book 1 of my Fixpoint trilogy, Overstrike. Here we are. Fact. Operation Unthinkable was the name for plans drawn up by the British Armed Forces Joint Planning Staff at the end of World War II. Requested by Winston Churchill, these plans proposed a preemptive Anglo-German attack on the Soviet Union. In most realities, these plans were never put in place. Prologue. London, 1948. Captain Howard, they're waiting for you. The military escort opened the door to show Joseph Howard into the Westminster Cabinet bunker's crowded meeting room. All but one seat was already filled, and at the head of the centre table sat the Prime Minister, her face stern. "Howard," she said, her relief apparent. "Thank God. Sit and we'll begin." "Yes, Mother." Staff withdrew, doors were closed, and 15 pairs of eyes focused intently as they waited for her to speak. "Gentlemen, we stand on the brink of defeat. However, I must insist that no words spoken today leave this room." What sounded like distant thunder could be felt through the floor. Trails of dust fell, and glowing filaments briefly flickered in electric lights. Seemingly unperturbed, the thin woman pressed on. "Stalin may be upon us, however, Churchill's move was not as overzealous as it may seemed. Nor was it as rash decision as widely reported. It was taken with the knowledge that, come the day, come the worst, come the situation that we find ourselves in now, we at least would have options." The Prime Minister paused and surveyed the confusion in the room. "In the dossier in front of you is such an option. Operation Overstrike." Overstrike was the name that the Commission had given to applying a reality graph far beyond what had ever been back-propagated and fixed before. The safety net that they'd discussed prior to mounting Operation Unthinkable. The preemptive Anglo-German attack in 1945. The abortive attack that had led them to total war. Since then, Joseph has watched through the rift, tracking a number of outcomes, but he now struggled to hold Overstrike, their single last chance to graft themselves out of trouble. Hope. Fading. If only it were as vibrant as the pre-war branch that Joseph still held for his wife, a potential reality where he'd never signed up and where Ruth had survived. Of course, Joseph had petitioned for that alternative, to graft Ruth's branch. However, concerned that their work in avoiding Nazi atrocities would be undone, that the war with Germany would be extended or even lost, the Commission had flatly refused him, and warned that any unilateral action would suffer the direst of consequences. The Commission had called it regrettable. Regrettable. The word still stuck in his throat. Back in the room, the PM, or Mother, as she had affectionately become known, rose from her seat to stand, arms locked with a weight resting on her clenched knuckles of each hand. "So, gentlemen," she said, "if we are agreed, only a select few of us will even remember this conversation. We will, however, with God's grace, be spared what is inevitably to come. Now is the time for unity. Therefore, I must ask if any one of you has an objection for it to be raised now." Round the chamber, the silence was deafening. Joseph looked from face to face, the tension palpable. Seconds dragged by, and Joseph Howard swore to always recall this moment. "Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes this, and likely all sessions. May God have mercy on our souls. Captain Howard, if you'd be so kind." Joseph nodded and focused through the rift. He knew what he needed to do, but it was still not going to be easy. not with a branch so distant and withered. Within his mind's eye he searched and attempted to bring it into focus. But to his surprise he felt resistance. Something was pushing back against him, trying to stop him. How? Stalin didn't know about the commission, did he? Unless he had his own. Slowly the branch began to sharpen. But this was hard. Too hard. He'd expected that he'd be able to yank it towards him, to graft it to their timeline. But no, beads of sweat formed on his brow. Through the haze, the sound of gunfire and voices was heard outside, and the doors opened. "You will stop this immediately." He looked at the Russian officer who now stood in the doorway, gun in hand. "Captain Howard, as you've no doubt discovered, we have men opposing you. You will not succeed. It is over." He raised the narrow-barreled pistol and Joseph began squeezing the trigger. "With a gift such as yours, this is a shame. But I have no choice. I'm sorry." Gasping, Joseph felt the searing heat of the rounds hit his chest. The room span, and he fell, his head smacking into the floor. In seemingly slow motion, all grip on the branch tumbled out of his mind and disappeared back across the rift. Out of his reach. Lost. Forever. His head began to swim. Gone. It was over. Unless, losing consciousness, he grabbed desperately at Ruth's pre-war branch, the forbidden fruit that still shone like a star, and with all his might, he pulled. So at the point we rejoin the story, it is over 50 years later, and Joseph's grandson, Matt, has just had his first baby. Chapter 2. Thomas Howard straightened the potting tray in front of him and tipped out the packet onto a small saucer. One by one he took a pinch of tomato seeds and pushed each into an array of compost plugs that he had arranged in a regular grid. He sat, perched on the edge of a battered stool, within the greenhouse that lay at the far end of the garden. The greenhouse had seen better days and been patched up in any number of ways, but that only increased Tom's affection for it. He had no time for brand new, not when it came to this. Growing was about playing the long game. That was part of its attraction to him. None of it was about appearance. It was about understanding nature. It was about gentle encouragement. It was about finding peace. Why did simple things relax him so? It was like knocking his brain into neutral. 36 years as a civil engineer had taken its toll and left him balding, hypertensive and overweight. Recently he'd increasingly felt uneasy, but the time he'd spent tending his plants removed all of that, made him forget that he bore little resemblance to his former self. It took Tom elsewhere. The sound of a phone interrupted his silence from the Sunday morning. Barbara would get that. "Tom!" Barbara's voice said, calling from the house, causing him to look up. "Tom! Matthew's a dad! We're grandparents!" Tom's seat forgotten, Tom hurried into the house, where his wife stood. Barbara was next to the aging telephone table, speaking into the receiver, her fingers wrapping themselves round the worn spiral cord. "That's wonderful. I'm so glad for you two. Your dad's here now. I'll put him on." He knew she wanted to talk for longer, but Barbara was always like that, looking after the pennies. Tom took the phone from Barbara, as she excitedly did a little dance, mouthing, "A boy, I told you." "Matthew?" "Hi, Dad. Oh, Grandad, I should say," came his son's crackling voice. "It's a boy, Ethan. I'm a dad. How mad's that? I'm on a payphone in the hospital, so I'll have to be quick, but I wanted to let you know." Tom inwardly felt his feathers plump with pride. A grandfather, how about that? It had not seemed 5 minutes since Matt had been born, and he'd become a father himself. Time. "That's fantastic, Matt. How's Jane?" "She's fine, great even, but knackered. All good. She's even asking for chocolate. Dad, I haven't got much change. Have you got the number for Grandpa's place?" Tom's heart sank. Why couldn't Matt let it go? Why couldn't he just leave it? Matt, you know I do. But are you sure that's a good idea? You know what he's been like recently. He's always been a crazy old man, but I don't know. It was true. Tom's relations with Joe had always been strained, but over the last year the old man has started making less and less sense. It was like Tom's childhood, the bad old days, all over again. But this time Tom had fallen out with him completely. Dad, I know you think he's lost it, but I need to let him know. Joseph Howard looked out of the window into the street. So sleep-deprived he barely recognised the events around him. Like a museum case of Victorian dolls, the residents sat motionless behind a veranda's glazed panels. Each with uncomprehending eyes, they watched at the ever-advancing world as it passed by. The curator of this particular display weaved her way between them before stopping and lightly touching his arm. Joe, you've got a phone call. Joe roused from his daze, looked up from the worn-out high-back Chesterfield to where the member of the nursing staff held a chunky cordless phone, its antenna extended. It's your grandson. I think he's got some exciting news. Joe put down his notebook and reached for the receiver. Hello? He croaked. Grandpa Joe, it's me, Matt. Jane's had a baby. It's a boy. Ethan Joseph Howard. The words stunned Joseph into silence. Grandpa? Joseph said nothing. What could he say? At the mention of Ethan's name, the graft had jumped, ever so slightly. But more than that, worse than that, he could now see what the variance was within it. Within the graft, this conversation did not happen. And now he saw it. Within the graft, Matt did not have a son. Ethan had no existence. He drew his breath and steeled himself for what he was about to say. Matty, listen carefully. Don't rush here, but it's crucial that you come and see me as soon as you can. It's time. The graft hung there suspended, but thankfully it had not moved further. Good. It was static for now and sufficiently distant. It just needed to stay that way. Joseph continued. Don't speak to anyone. Especially your father, especially Tom. Grandpa, is everything all right? Said his grandson, the concern evident in his voice. No, Matty, the very opposite. I think Ethan is in serious danger, grave danger. I need to talk to you about your son and some other things I should have told you a long time ago, but not over the phone. Come and see me, Matty. It's time. But make it look natural. They could already be watching. Without speaking further, Joseph Howard thumbed the phone's power switch and pushed the antenna back into the body before placing the handset on the table beside him. He once again picked up his notebook and continued to stare blankly out of the window. Joe sighed heavily. Why, Ethan? Other than him, what connection could there be? There would be dire consequences. If all debts were to be called in, why wait a lifetime to do it? Unless there was a new ACL, unless they needed to make an example of him, an object lesson to keep the other fixers in line. It was brilliant, perfect, brilliant in its monstrosity. Get with the programme, or after you've gone we'll erase your family, like we did with old Joseph Howard. That delicate balance. Joe's mouth dried, his horrific realisation washed over him. They were likely waiting for him to die or become too old and decrepit to oppose them, a soft target. Even though his family had the gift, it was latent, undeveloped. With no perception or interaction with the rift, they would never even see this coming. But the ACL, or whatever they called themselves now, didn't know he was onto them. Until his family was in a position to defend themselves, he needed to keep it that way. The veins on the back of his hands rose, and his knuckles whitened as the grip of his notebook tightened. If they thought Joseph Howard's family was going to go down without a fight, they were sadly mistaken. Thank you. You've been listening to Overstrike by CM Angus. Thank you.